right, so hello again, everyone. I saw some of you guys last week. My name's Liz, and I'm the program manager with Carolina Navigators at UNC Chapel Hill. And I have two more of my students this week, Kira and Gargi, that are going to talk to you about their experiences in Argentina and India. And they're going to talk a bit about protests and activism as well in those countries and give you some background information on those countries. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them.
Nice. Well, it's nice to meet you all. I'm Gargi. I'm a freshman at UNC Chapel Hill, so I haven't really been on campus yet, but it's been great so far. And I'm majoring in computer science right now. So our objectives for today are to identify the types of protests that we see in India and Argentina. I'll be talking about India mostly, and Kira will talk about Argentina. And then we want to kind of help you guys compare the protests that we see in those countries to the protests we see in the US. All right, so okay. I'll just give a little bit of background about India. I actually lived in India for 7 years. I moved to India when I was 10 and I moved back when I was 16. And some basic facts, the capital is Delhi. It's kind of in the north-ish of India. The languages spoken there are like numerous. There's 22 official languages of different states, but the main kind of national languages are Hindi and English, and all official communication happens in both those languages. And the prevalence of English just shows you how capitalism kind of left its mark on India. The population is huge, as I'm sure you're all aware, and Independence Day is August 15th, 1947. India is also very diverse in terms of geography. It's called a subcontinent because there's so many different types of like geographic conditions everywhere. There's the Himalayas, and then the plains, a desert, and several islands as well. India is located in Asia and it has 9 neighbors. So I was wondering if you guys knew any neighbors that India has, neighboring countries. If you can think of any guesses, please drop them in the chat. The fact that it's in Asia should give you a hint. Yeah, Pakistan is one neighbor. That's great. China is a neighbor. That's true. 2 out of 9. Nepal, that's another one. Great. This one's a hard question. I didn't know most of these until this presentation. Myanmar, Afghanistan, perfect, yeah. Those are 5. And then other ones include Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Maldives. Bhutan, someone said Bhutan, and then Sri Lanka. So I think that's 9, yeah. It's the world's largest democracy and it's 7th largest by land area.
So we're going to transition over into discussing protests in both countries. We do have some preliminary questions to get you thinking about the subject of protest, what it looks like in the United States historically or modern day, as well as certain types of protests that you're familiar with. Yeah, if you, for the first question, for example, what are some popular forms of protest that you can think of? Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and say it, or you can put it in the chat as well. Or you can answer the second question too.
So yeah, the first one, the different ways that people might protest.
Mm-hmm.
Sit-ins. Mm-hmm.
Yep, sit-ins.
And you can also type in if you can think of any movements in US history that maybe you guys have learned about in school where protest was used. Rallies. Good.
Walking down the streets. Other forms I can think of include like strikes, boycotts, demonstrations, and different movements such as that. And if you can think of any historical movements in the United States in which protest was used as well, feel free to say those. I know oftentimes protests have to deal with either social issues, economic issues, political issues, Boston Tea Party, women's
Women's
rights.
rights, civil rights.
Yeah. So I was definitely thinking in the correct headspace. So yeah, I just wanted to familiarize ourselves with some of the examples in the United States, just so we can have a point of reference for when we go into discussing each country and what it has looked like historically up until today and the different types of protest movements that have occurred. Yeah.
Yeah, moving on to India and some of the historical protests that the country has seen. I'm sure everybody knows that India was colonized by the British, and the British rule was known as the British Raj. And it started in 1858 and continued all the way until 1947 when independence was won. So a big form of protest in India historically was peaceful protest, and this was kind of spearheaded by Mahatma Gandhi, and he called his movement Satyagraha. Satyagraha basically just stands for peaceful, nonviolent protest. But this does not mean that there wasn't violence during that time period of protest. One example of a protest that turned violent was the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. And the picture on the bottom right shows, depicts this massacre. Basically, a lot of peaceful protesters had gathered in a closed compound. So there was only one entrance and they were all inside and just demonstrating, holding up posters and just peacefully protesting. But the British commanders in that area brought in a lot of armed soldiers, and they blocked the only entrance and opened fire on all these unarmed protesters. So it was a very bloody massacre, and something that kind of was it was horrible because the protesters were unarmed and it was supposed to be peaceful, but it turned into something very violent and deadly. But yeah, some more examples of protests that were more peaceful and nonviolent and were spearheaded by Gandhi include the non-cooperation movement and the Quit India movement in 1920 and 1942. And both of these promoted protests in the form of boycott and rallies and marches. It was a way of showing the British rulers that Indian people were not willing to cooperate with this colonial rule, and they wanted their own kind of self-government.
So moving a little bit more forward into the present. So I mentioned earlier about how in Argentina in 2001, they had a period of 10 days in which they ran through 5 presidents in a matter of time. And this happened in 2001. It was a result of a severe economic depression that began in 1998. And if you learn a little bit more about Buenos Aires, you will be able to see the different ways, or I could say booms and busts of its economy. It started off being one of the most prosperous nations in the Western Hemisphere, but has since really struggled with problems of inflation and prices not being very stable at all. And so in Buenos Aires, the capital city experienced the most turmoil in December 2001, with protesters taking to the streets and with pots and pans to demonstrate. So if you look at videos of that time, you'll see massive amounts of people doing protesting and demonstrations and rallying. And you'll see them with their pots and pans and banging. And it started off that way, and it got more violent as the days continued. And I watched the video about how, for example, the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, they did their circle around the plaza, but the police officers prevented them from continuing, which is when it got pretty violent. And riots began to happen because people didn't have access to food, and the government also had to freeze accounts, which brought a lot more people out to the streets, honestly in anger because of the economic issues that the country was facing. And yeah, they're really calling for changes to the different ways that the economy was being organized, which led to a lot of people having a lot to say with regards to how to handle bettering the different ways that the country could repair its economy. And so there's many videos you can find about this period of time, but usually you'll see a lot of people, with their pots and pans walking along the streets, calling for a change.
Moving to more recent protests again in India. India is a very heavily agricultural dependent economy. So there's a lot of farming that goes on and several issues that farmers face. All the pictures just show you different farmer strikes and protests regarding agriculture reforms. Farmers face issues like not having enough machines and having to do more menial labor. They face issues of going into debt and not being able to afford seed for producing crop, and also not getting the right kind of prices for the crops that they make or they grow. So recent protests over the past 2-3 years have looked like the pictures show. That they're mostly just a lot of people coming out and marching down the streets and holding up posters and demonstrating, just trying to make their voice heard to the government.